Get ready. Today we're tackling downtime, planned or unexpected, that can disrupt your operations. Discover how SharePlex keeps your critical systems online with near real-time replication and flexible architecture. Learn expert strategies to minimize risk, maintain availability, and future-proof your environment. And who better than Bill Brunt to guide us through it? Bill, I'll hand it over to you.
SharePlex Skills 101, the future of always-on data infrastructure. My name is Bill Brunt. I'm a sales engineer for Quest Software. Welcome. The topics for today, this is actually the third in our series for season 2. I'm going to start by talking about the challenge, or challenges rather, to always-on data infrastructure. I'll talk about unsupported data types, architecture around database migration specifically, but that's extensible to other areas. What are some of the high-level steps you'll go through to provide high availability? And then dive into some of the details in those steps, specifically activation, instantiation, something I call catching up, because that is certainly an aspect you need to take into account when managing high availability using database replication. And then the last step is validation. That's a very important step because it ensures a level of data quality. Failing back, helps mitigate risk. And of course, the ultimate is zero downtime. And yes, that is possible. It's just a lot of work. Beyond the data, we're talking today about database replication, and there's more to these high availability maintenance periods, with planned downtime than just the data, in particular around, migrations. Just a reminder, as I said, this is the third in the series, and you can see what we had in season 1. So if there's other content here you're interested in, I encourage you to go see it. Now, what are the challenges to always-on data infrastructure? Well, certainly around availability, there's typically service level agreements, and there's different types of events and activities related. So if you start at the highest level by dividing, the root cause of outages due to planned events and unplanned events, at the highest level for planned activities, you can say, well, I'm changing something with my hardware or my operating system or my database or my application. Within the database, there's lots of different activities. Archive is particularly interesting because you may, for example, be set up with a case where you're archiving the transaction system, but you keep the history in the reporting database. That has some special considerations. It'll be outside, the details of that are outside of the scope of today's call. It's really focused around maintenance and migrations for the planned events. I'll touch briefly now on application. We won't have time to go in depth, but application availability comes down to, are there changes in the underlying schema of the database? And typically there are, and interestingly enough, it tends to be a lot less than people anticipate. We have maintained availability in this case. It's similar but different than zero downtime that has to manage conflict resolution, but still, it's the same idea that you've got to code some things into PLC routines that are being posted. Now, I didn't start off today by saying the prerequisite. You've got to be using SharePlex today to really get full value out of this presentation. You're certainly going to learn things about what SharePlex is capable of, but if you're not familiar with it, you're going to find parts of this are very technical and assume a working knowledge of SharePlex. So, planned events. There's KPIs that contribute to service level agreements. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I would encourage you to gather information about your particular organization, whether it's, for example, for unplanned events, recovery time objective. How long will it take us to restore services? Recovery point objective. What data will be there? All of these should have meaning to you. If they don't, just do a little chat GPT, Copilot, whatever. But gather information in your environment regarding these different KPIs, because there are specific capabilities in SharePlex that can help contribute to this. Availability compliance may be the least well known. There can be, particularly for MSPs, contractual language that talks about a certain level of availability maintained during a period. And, if you have an unexpected outage, you can threaten that where you need to threaten the availability compliance, that is, and where you need to be very careful with the remaining time in a period. And maybe it doesn't normally need this type of high availability technology, but if you're at risk of financial penalties, for example, understanding availability compliance can be helpful, because this technology can really help maintain it in some rather dramatic ways. And we're going to show the specific pieces that you need to know about to do so. So let's talk a little bit about one of the challenges that people have with making replication, SharePlex replication work, or any replication. You have unsupported data types. I don't know of any logical replication solution that completely supports all data types. Now, your database may not have any unsupported data types, or it might. It's important to know, are these large? Are they small? Do they have a lot of activity? These sorts of things. I mean, if you have too much of your database by volume, and also very high transaction rates on that, it can adversely affect effective use of the technology. If the tables are small, for example, and this is the simplest way to handle it. You're going to take, unless you're doing active-active, which I'll talk about at the end, you're going to be switching users from one instance to another in a very small switch period. And if it's small, just import the objects that contain the unsupported data types. If the tables are larger, then you can use a capability in SharePlex called vertical partitioning to do only select columns for the supported data types. And you need to time how long it's going to take to export and import the table with unsupported data types. We'll call that time to export. Now, what you can do is you can create and implement triggers that are on insert for and update, of course, all the DML that's going to affect the record. But you're going to record now, the table, the row ID, the primary key, what column changed, and a timestamp in this table. And so we're going to have the time to export as well as the change table. And that time that it took to do that export import, and it's not the the entire large table, but rather it's the changes that have taken place that this change table will track for you. You're simply telling the trigger, please keep track of those rows that had changes for that unsupported data type. And then you can create a query which will move just that data into its own dedicated table. The change table helps drive that, and it creates a table we'll call net change. So you export your NCT on the source, you import it in the target, and then you update the large table now with the unsupported data type from the smaller, that should say NCT, not NT at the end. So that's a means. Now, that was a lot of information in a brief time period. I'm absolutely available for questions. We take them in the chat, as well as, afterwards, just contact your account manager. They'll set up meetings, and, we can chat through these details more. Now, there's other ways of doing it. I mentioned small tables. Also, if you have large unsupported tables, you can use vertical partitioning. Again, you're supporting only the columns that have supported data types. And then what you can do is put triggers in place that essentially decode whatever is inside of the unsupported data type, put it into a supported data type in a companion table, and then this way you can then use that. You can replicate that other column and do the reverse on the target so that as changes come in or run a batch process. It's a similar idea. This is a little bit more involved to do so. It's really a matter of timing how long things take. Now, this has to do with very tight service level agreements. So this is one of the advantages of using SharePlex is you don't have to tightly time and choreograph everything. However, there are particular parts, if you're looking to really minimize downtime, you may even want to, typically we'll tell folks it's only the time it takes to switch users over, but we're adding to it right here. But this is a means to do it and still keep the downtime very small. The example I'm going to use, this should be very familiar. If you've attended any of the other sessions, we have a current production system. It's working, fully operational. The users are attached. There's an empty new production environment. SharePlex is installed, moves through a series of queues, replicates across the network, and we've stopped the post queue. So it's accumulating, and you're starting replication before you start the process that says, let me grab a copy of the existing data. We don't care how you do it, just that you've got a record of when it occurred via in terms of a stream, either the SCN in the case of Oracle or the LSN in terms of Postgres. Once that new production environment is instantiated from this backup or snapshot or data pump export, again, we don't care. Just that it's to an SCN in the case of Oracle or LSN in the case of Postgres. Now, once you do that, you start posting, but we run a reconcile command, and it basically examines that queue, throws out everything that's already in the database. So this is a rough process, whether it's a database migration or whether it's maintenance activity. You won't have instantiation when you have fully active, or when you have HA setups where you have continuous replication in place and they're always in sync, except during periods of either planned or unplanned maintenance. Now, once this process flow takes place, there's many smaller activities inside of this that need to be taken into account. And we're going to go a little bit deeper now into what some of the details are. Again, you need to be familiar with SharePlex to really get the most value out of these. We talked about the unsupported data types. Activation. That's the act of starting to replicate. There's a lot of consideration. I'm convinced that as humans, we make nearly everything in the world, and there's a lot of details. We make it sophisticated, I'll say. And so activation is like that as well. Instantiation, that's your means of creating the target database. Now, there's this queue of activity that is gathering up when we stopped the poster process. So you have to catch up. You have to work through that in order to bring the users over to that new target system. Validation, that's making sure your source and target contain the same data. And then there's failback. Many of us with these sorts of events, I used to be internal IT. I was for 13 years. I sat as a member of change control as well as submitting changes, right? And one of the big questions is, what will you do if the new system does not work? What is your failback plan? How will you manage that? Well, we'll talk about that. Now, when activation starts, there's a number of activities, and most of the time, these activities, I mean, this is for your information. Do you need to know that it assigns an activation ID? Generally, unless there's an issue, no. Know that we do process activation, not by the order they appear in the config file, but rather by the object ID. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the two important ones are there is a brief lock on the table, unless you say no, I don't want it locked, and that applications that have no wait built into them can fail because the table may be locked and they don't wait for the lock. So you need to know something about your apps. That is not an issue we encounter that I've heard of, but you must consider this. Now, when do you have to activate? Well, if you've added or removed tables, or if you've changed where that data is going to go. And when we say route, we mean the target host, the target database, the target schema, the target table name, and columns. So now, replication starts, as I said, I believe I mentioned this, when activation occurs. It will fail if DDL happens to run while that process is going through, and failed tables are not replicated. If you've had any experience with this, you know that we mention a log where additional details can be found. You look in that log, and it'll tell you exactly why it failed. I'm going to talk about some parameters that can help you manage failed objects in just a moment. So verification, this is different than the verification I mentioned as a distinct step. There's a command, verify config name. So it does a few things. Checks the syntax, make sure the object does exist, make sure that DNS resolves the target host, not the database. Reports on duplicate entries for a single object. Now, I've got an asterisk next to that, and I'm going to tell you something which isn't supported, but it can be helpful as you're working. You can go over to the host table, you can put host entries in there, and you can get by this by using aliases for your hosts. I found that helpful, particularly as I've wanted to see different file formats coming across, but it's really only good for configuration testing. The verification, it helps identify objects that are skipped. Now, we do have an enhancement request in for activation right now, which says, well, rather than me failing when capture encounters an unsupported data type, and it's not a catastrophic failure by any means. Things are very recoverable with SharePlex, but it's steps. So it'd be nice if the verify said, hey, tell us if there's unsupported data types, and that is coming. So let's talk about a little bit of tuning related to activation. So it can take a while, and the more tables you have, the longer it can take. And sometimes, it's noticeable if you have 500 tables, for example, you'll wait. But what if you have 90,000 tables, which SharePlex customers certainly do? So you can multi-thread this. By default, the activation threads is 3. Now, you can vary that. It can go up to 32. You can either specify an individual value in a given activation. So I'm activating now. I'm going to say use these number of threads. And when I do that, that will override whatever the global parameter is, which is the next piece I'm showing here with the set param SPOCF thread count. Now, you can have multiple instances of SharePlex for the same data source. That is correct. Meaning you can, with a given instance or install, let me define what instance is. So instance is basically a distinct var-dir directory. So you can have more than one var-dir, and you can have more than one set of SharePlex binaries running, and they reside on different ports. Now, if you have these multiple instances, so that what I just described, I inferred that was a shared install. You can also do separate installs where there's binaries that are paired with each of those var-dirs. Now, if you have multiple instances of SharePlex for the same data source, these can all run in parallel and help decrease the activation time. Activation time, again, is locking tables. Now, you can say no lock, but that can create issues if there's activity on it. You will get faster activation with no lock, but you can't have the activity running. So if you're struggling to get your activation in during, for example, a planned maintenance window versus an exception maintenance window, which is where you've negotiated time, I should have put a banner up at the top that mentioned these. You're going to see that in the other slides. Now, if you consult our documentation, it gives seemingly somewhat contradictory guidance. And if you look in one section, which references the threads piece for activation, you'll see, I believe it's this mention of 5 threads. And then later with the parameter setting, it talks about, 10 or more threads could show. Here's the deal. So you've got seemingly contradictory guidance in our documentation. Test the scenarios with your environment. Because if you have a 32 CPU machine, you're going to benefit from more threads certainly than 5. 10 is a great suggestion, but it's going to vary based on your environment. So test it. Find out your sweet spot. Now, you may not have readily available a machine similar to production. We do this. We go out to AWS. We spin up stuff on a very short-term basis. It's very cost-effective. If you're, wanting to tune something like activation and other pieces, I've done quite a bit of that. Test it, use our support, cite all the parts of the documentation, describe to them what you're wanting to accomplish. Again, we're very proud of our support. And customers consistently report good experiences, and that's my recommendation to help squeeze the activation time to as small as possible. Okay, instantiation. So the documentation is very strong here. It talks about stopping post, activate, backup, restore, use restored database, using reconcile, etc. Now, here's some strategies as you instantiate. First of all, be satisfied and plan on getting it right once. Meaning, okay, as long as I get this object over there replicating up to date, I'm done, I move on. I don't have to redo everything. And that, you may, for example, go to restore or export, import, and maybe half your database comes in. This is not an atypical experience, particularly if it's, your first time doing this sort of thing. If it's old hat, it's just going to stream right in. Well, congrats. That's great. But know that you can break it into pieces. You can do what we call progressive activation, progressive instantiation. So you activate, great, I get all these objects. Well, I plan on bringing just those objects in the database, and I learn from it. And now I'm done with those objects because they are replicated. Then I can build on it in this progressive fashion. When you do activate and you say activate config file name, of course, what's happening? What's happening is that any new objects will need that lock and building the object cache, assigning act ID, all that kind of stuff. But the existing ones you're just going to skip. So you can, if you don't have to do all 90,000 tables during that maintenance period, you could do 45,000 week 1, 45,000 week 2, through progressive activation. Now, if you want to catch up, you have to have available capacity in terms of what your throughput is. Like maybe I'm normally replicating 60 gigs an hour, right? And if I'm going to have a huge backlog of 1,200 gigs when I'm done, due to, 20 hours, well, then I've got to have enough additional capacity or throughput available to me, where I can push through that data and not take 6 years to catch up. If you don't have that capacity, this can turn into a huge task. Figuring out what your headroom is important, although it's easier said than done. Now, these are the variables. What's my total time And that includes, my ongoing activity as well as working through my backlog. That's my total time in hours. What is my application rate? How quickly is data coming into my source database? SharePlex rate, how quickly can it apply it to the target? And the poster stopped hours. How long did my maintenance actually take? Where I've stopped the poster, because you're going to stop post, you're going to do your maintenance, and you're going to start post, but it's still an outage because you have to catch up before you switch the users over. So if you take your application rate, you multiply it by the total time, that's going to give your volume. Just like your volume will be gotten if you take your SharePlex rate and you multiply it by the difference of the total time, subtracting how long poster is stopped for. So these two numbers are equal. We do some algebra. I'm going to encourage you to come back to this. We're not going to solve this right now, but here's the result of this algebra. If you want to know the total time it's going to take, so you're going to design to fit into a maintenance window with the existing SharePlex throughput, you use the top formula. If, however, you're very concerned, you have to fit into a certain time frame, and that is, so your TTH, and that has to be 2 hours. Well, then you may need to increase your SharePlex rate, and now you can solve for the rate to be able to achieve that. Now, how do you do that? You make replication run faster. Now, I'm going to talk about a few things. Multiple cops are simply multiple instances of SharePlex parameters, controls how it works. Beyond the scope of today, but very important, is that your workload, the mix of your transactions type, which we're going to cover initially in an upcoming session. We'll touch on it. There's a lot more depth there. But certainly the cops and the parameters I'm going to be talking about today. Now, follow the manual in terms of, setting up multiple instances of SharePlex. In this case, I've got 3 instances, and what I've done is I've got 3 schemas that I've distributed to each of my instances of SharePlex, each of them with 10 queues starting on the export side. Now, this creates a little more network traffic than necessary because each of these queues has flow control. It'd be better sending across perhaps 1 queue and then splitting it into poster queues on the target. It's typically post which is slowing down. So, if you don't have activity on your target, you're not concerned with reconsistency across the transactions until the users get on, naturally you do, or you haven't done the analysis to break tables into groups where reconsistency is important, and these groups do not affect one another. We'll talk a little bit about analyze config in another session and how that can be done. But multiple poster queues, this is the syntax to say, on this host, I'd like an export queue, and then I would like it go to this target system and this database. And what I'm doing is I'm saying in the very first column, I look at the last character. I happen to know all these tables end with a number. And so we evenly distribute by the last digit. Very arbitrary distribution. You're going to have to do more work than that in terms of choosing the objects, if it's for reporting, that kind of thing. If it's not for reporting high availability, then you can drop constraints, reestablish them, for example. And high availability is a little different beast. So now the other thing you need to do is adjust your and I want to call out that be sure your system has adequate resources, can halt the under-resourced. I know that from personal experience. So the way I was working this is I did benchmarks of very high volume. I was pushing close to 1 terabyte per hour of redo logs. And I only ran for 15 minutes. But what I would do is use a configuration machine that was really cheap to operate, and then only turn the dials to have very powerful, very expensive machines when I actually ran the benchmark. Nice thing about AWS and other cloud vendors. The boxes I have circled, be sure your machine, or squares around it, be sure your machine is at, like, for example, I'm saying, okay, we're going to have 31 queues, all right? And then each of these queues is going to be 2 gigs in size. Well, I run like this. I immediately take nearly 60 gigs of memory, more than 60 gigs of memory on the machine. I did this with a 16 gig machine. It didn't, work so well. So make sure that as you set and tweak these parameters, you're adjusting for, if you're using the same model I described, or you have a configuration machine, a high performance machine, you adjust appropriately. There will be a session on benchmarking in the future, and we're going to go into great depth on those. Now, beyond the data, this is a good story. If you're doing a migration, you can also fail back. Now, the fail back means that maybe you're moving from Oracle to Postgres, or maybe you're moving from one Oracle version to another, whatever it is. If you set up replication going the other way, when you're in change control and someone says, what are you going to do if that new system doesn't work? You can say, well, we're going to have all the data that comes into the new system going back to the original. And don't worry, SharePlex doesn't loop the transactions. So when that occurs, we're just going to switch the users back to the original system, which we know works, and all our data will be there. That's a great fit. It's an insurance policy, is what it is. Okay. Now then, zero downtime. This is way beyond what I can possibly talk about in a 4-hour meeting. I can only tell you at a very high level that the ultimate and to be able to provide zero downtime uses a process called active-active. You'll notice these arrows point both ways. I tell customers this is about 10 times the work than compared to, unless your app's really simple, right? But if you've absolutely, positively got to have zero downtime, this is a way you can do it. And when a node goes offline and you want to do maintenance on one of these nodes, you simply prevent additional connections from being allowed. And through attrition, existing connections are dropped. You may need to be monitoring an app server, that kind of thing. But eventually, all the connections get off of that. You take that offline, you do your work, you bring it back online, and you rinse and repeat through each of these nodes. We have customers with more than just 3 systems in active-active. We have a customer with a massive system in 3-way replication. So if you want to learn more, get a copy of this, click on that link. Hopefully the PDF out there will have an active link where it says Hotwire uses SharePlex for AWS cloud migration. And so these 2 gentlemen, don't take our word for it. Here they are. They present at Oracle World or AI World or Cloud World, whatever it's called today. And they described exactly how they were able to achieve zero downtime. It's a good story, and you too can do that. It's work. And, like I said, it's more involved than I'm able to talk to today. Now, I said beyond the data. So SharePlex is great in terms of moving that data over to a target. What you're going to get out of it is a dramatic reduction in your effort to migrate. Why? Again, if you've attended other sessions, I've said you don't choreograph it. You don't rehearse. You don't practice over and over. You get to do this during the day, and you only have to get it right once. That's how your savings occurs, even though you got to learn this other new technology, SharePlex, if you haven't used it. And now, and that 40% reduction was for a first-time user of SharePlex in production. Downtime reduction, typically greater than 99%. I mentioned already failback from Postgres back to Oracle. Your users can also look at their data in the new environment. And if you want to let them, they can go ahead and change it. You can stop post. And then when they're done, you can say, you know what? You do a compare. And if you know the transactions that they hit, you can say compare using with a config that's dedicated just to tables for that. And our compare repair will find the differences and repair them while replication is taking place. So you can do real live testing. You can stop your post, let them go in there, mildly corrupt the target by having active transactions, and then fix it with compare repair, be back in sync. There's no better testing. This is transactions they've already done, they're familiar with. There's no better testing. Now, Toad can help you do code object conversion. Watch the video. That's an active hyperlink. Don't have time today. Irwin can help convert your schema. So, you've got different data types, for example, in Oracle versus Postgres, and this will do the mapping of these. Questions, we're going to be here for a little bit to take those. Feel free to chime in if you've been waiting. And lastly, the next session we're giving is going to be October 29th, benchmark skills for maximizing SharePlex scalability. Clay has invited me as a guest for that. So 20 minutes of that time will be me sharing a very high throughput benchmarking scenario. I showed some of the settings for that today. Really hope you've enjoyed today, and thanks for coming.